Is evil truly an external force, or does it stand to be a result of the inner perverseness and wickedness that resides within every human being? Searching for a novel that delves in this theme for a school related topic or just for the sake of your own knowledge? Well, look no further. Stephen King's The Shining offers a thoroughgoing depiction of the various complexities of psychological nature. Through use of various Gothic elements, the novel follows a broken man in Jack Torrance and his gradual progression from protagonist to antagonist. Ultimately falling to the temptation of his inner goals and aspirations, Torrance's gradual downfall holds strong and direct parallels to the biblical story of the fall of man, as his inability to conceal his innate sin mirrors Adam and Eve's exile from the Garden of Eden.
Utilizing themes of isolation, domestic violence, and psychological decay, King depicts how supernatural forces associate with the internal human weaknesses, as the undeniable resemblance to the fall of man portrays a message to the reader of the unforgiving consequences of giving into inner temptation.
Commonly regarded as the king of horror, Stephen King is renowned for his work in American Gothic literature, as he holds a masterful ability to combine classic Gothic elements with a heavy focus on building relatable and well-developed characters that actively engage the reader. Following the successes of his horror novels Carrie and Salem's Lot, King published The Shining in 1977, taking inspiration from his stay at the Stanley Hotel in Colorado, in which he had a dream of his son being chased through the halls terrified. While this did serve as a major source of inspiration, the central conflict of the novel is intended to be a reflection of the author's own psychological struggles in the late 1970s. Admitting to having lengthy struggles with temper and alcoholism, the actions of Jack Torrance are intended to symbolize King's fear of his own violent impulses, as he utilizes the novel as a form of self-reflection to the possible harm his habits may cause to his loved ones.
King evidently utilizes his literary works to reflect his dissatisfaction with the current state of the world. This is best exemplified through the author's interview with Paul Janesco, in which he's asked, how did he see the world? And he replies with, I'm not very optimistic about the world. I think that shows in the books. The whole situation is bad, but I don't think the future looks very bright.
We follow Jack Torrance, a struggling writer who decides to take a job as the hotel caretaker. He hopes that the quiet will heal his family and help him write again. However, the story takes us further. Snow cuts them off from the world, and the silence begins to whisper. Continuing on, his son Danny has a strange power referred to as the Shining. This supernatural ability lets him see things that others can't, and in the Overlook, what he sees shouldn't even exist. Voices move, shadows call, and the past refuses to stay buried. Over time, Jack's mind starts to crack under the hotel's spell. The walls seem alive, feeding on the fear, the madness, and the isolation. Like a castle in Gothic literature, the Overlook traps its guests in beauty and horror, a place where the supernatural meets the psychological, and where real terror may be the darkness inside.
Hair of the dog that bit me. Bourbon on the rocks. That'll do her. No charge, dear Mr. Torrance. No charge? Your money's no good here. Orders from the house.
Now that we provided some background information to The Shining, we can start to delve deeper into some of its specific themes and messages. Throughout the novel, the perceptions of Danny and Wendy Torrance entirely blame the altering of Jack as due to the corrupting forces of the Overlook, with his figure transforming into the raving voice of the hotel itself. However, observing from a more complete perspective across the entirety of the novel, Jack Torrance's corruption serves as a more complex representation of internal evil, as his isolation within the Overlook provides a true unmasking to his previously concealed psychological forces. Alone on the hotel's rooftop, Torrance reflects on his battles with his temper, acknowledging that all his life he'd been trying unsuccessfully to control it, having to continually address himself as a really nice guy who's just going to have to cope with his temper. Using symbolism to depict the importance of the character's reflection, King draws focus to Jack's confrontation with the wasp's nest as a foreshadowing of his embrace of innate evil, underlying that the action of unwittingly sticking his hand into the great wasp's nest of life left civilized behavior obsolete, turning him from an educated man to wailing ape in 5 easy seconds. While not entirely stated, Jack's questionable action serves as a symbol to the beginning of the character's loss of consciousness, as his inner perverseness and revealing temper begin to dominate his sense of reason, pushing him towards his inevitable downfall. To further support this theme, reference can be made to the thorough published articles of respected individuals such as Musab Natik Ibrahim. In his analysis of contemporary Gothicism in The Shining, Ibrahim attempts to depict that the Overlook's haunted appearance acts as a reflection of Jack's secrets of the subconscious, as its trapping isolation reveals the demons that already live in Jack and are still in existence for the time being. Further connecting his point to King's use of symbolism, the professor argues that Jack's gradual conversion represents the common nature of all human beings, verbalizing that every one of us has a mixture of good and evil.
Perhaps they need a good talking to, if you don't mind my saying so. Perhaps a bit more.
As we see his state having worsened after a lengthy period of time in the hotel, Jack Torrance's unmasking of his inner forces is best reflected through his interactions with the previous caretaker, Delbert Grady, through which his full giving into temptation fuels his descent into an entirely evil and wicked state. Ready to break his lengthy sobriety, Torrance sees himself alone with the delusion of a large gala, with his aspirations of authority being brought upon him through Grady praising him as a true scholar who could well ascend the Overlook's organizational structure if he were to deal with his son's waywardness. With both the gala and Grady being a figure of Jack's imaginations who both feed into his alcoholism and aspirations, the scene stands as a symbol of the complete corruption of Jack Torrance, as the author states that Jack's actions of indulging in his recognized flaws and giving into temptation demonstrate what it's like to stick your hand into the nest entirely. The respective articles of Matthias Clausen and Michael Kevin Bryan provide effective insight and analysis to Jack's aspirations for power. In his article Hauntings of Human Nature, Clausen underscores the symbolism of Jack's illusions, emphasizing that King's depiction of Jack in the Gala suggests that evil is at base human, as the imaginary promise of a position of power, prestige, and responsibility directs him into harming his family. Agreeing with Clausen's perspective, Michael Bryan's article focuses on the reasoning of Jack's inability to control his inner temptation. Quoting Maslow's hierarchy of needs, Bryan mentions that when a man could not fulfill his psychological needs, their only purpose in life is to fulfill it by all means, using it to demonstrate how Jack's isolation constantly reminds him of his discontent with the state of his life. Ultimately, when combining this analysis with the likes of well-supported articles, we are able to recognize the major theme of Jack Torrance's isolation in the Overlook revealing his inner evil, as the character's inability to control his recognized alcoholism, temper, and aspirations for power conduct his transition into a devilish state. Tying it to our biblical theme in the fall of man, it becomes clear that we can make a connection to Adam and Eve and their own inability to control their temptations of eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which leaves them subject to punishment just like Jack Torrance, as they are forever banished from the perfect Garden of Eden.
Whenever you come in here and interrupt me, you're breaking my concentration. You're distracting me. And it will then take me time to get back to where I was. Understand?
Yeah.
Fine. And we're gonna make a new rule. Whenever I'm in here, you hear me typing. Whether you don't hear me typing, what the fuck you hear me doing in here, when I'm in here, that means that I am working. That means don't come in. Now, do you think you can handle that?
Yeah.
The real horror of The Shining does not come from ghosts or haunted halls, but from the violence that grows inside the family system when anger and isolation go unchecked. The Shining explores the real horrors of domestic violence. Jack is driven mad by the hotel as it preys upon his weaknesses and dark past. Elizabeth Jean Hornbeck touches on this in Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf? Domestic Violence in The Shining, and she describes his transformation as a Jekyll and Hyde one, from a loving, providing father into a crazed, axe-wielding killer. Jack Torrance becomes a monster, representing the monstrous behavior that is experienced in reality by many families. Jack's descent into madness mirrors the escalation of an abusive household. He begins with verbal abuse. When Wendy goes to check on him as he's writing, he loses his temper at her and he thinks, at times she could be the stupidest bitch. Want some water? She asks brightly. No, I just want you to get the fuck out of here. The hotel is not the cause of Jack's violence. It intensifies what's already within him. An article by Michael Kevin Bryan Saherchin, The Aggressive Jack Torrance in The Shining by Stephen King, a psychological analysis, in that he mentions a frustrated man will behave aggressively towards another object or another human to release his anger. Eventually, Jack's anger gets the better of him, and he releases his anger. He snaps at Wendy and Danny. As Wendy realizes that he was going to kill her and then kill Danny, she jumps into action and is now in survival mode. Wendy transforms from a subservient wife to a fighter, and ultimately a heroine. In the article Women, Role Failure, and the Nuclear Family in Stephen King's The Shining by Kyra McCauley, this article dissects Wendy's character, diving into her fear of failing her role in the nuclear family. McCauley's main argument is that though Wendy struggles with this familial structure, The Shining ultimately argues that women can only free themselves from the stress and abuse of their roles that impose upon them by completely abandoning the structure of the nuclear family. King's portrayal of Wendy from a passive victim to a figure of empowerment reflects the archetype of a feminist heroine. Early on in the novel, it states, most of what she believed centered around her love for Jack. This very much proves that she was stuck in this nuclear wife role, and she was unable to be independent without her husband Jack. However, through the second half of the book, Wendy proves that she is strong and she is competent without Jack. While Jack's attacking her with the mallet, she manages to grab her strength and stab him, burying the kitchen knife into his lower back up to the handle. In the end, she's able to put the pieces back together, as Halloran observes, proving that she is strong without Jack. Wendy's character development throughout the book is inspirational for women. She's able to escape an abusive cycle that she and Danny were trapped within. Her shift from blind victim to fully aware of all around her mirrors that of Eve in the story of the fallen man, where Eve goes from blind of all the sins of the earth to fully aware, and she chooses her own fate, as Wendy does.
Red rum, 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 stop it, red rum, red rum.
Throughout the journey, the consistent presence of the supernatural power possessed by Danny can be interpreted as a reflection upon the fall of man. In Genesis, Scripture talks about knowledge and the consequences that come with it. We learn how knowledge of good and evil leads to the loss of innocence, and a similar sequence is shown in Stephen King's writing. Throughout the journey, Danny's ability leads to further harm, solely through the results of his knowledge. You can see this demonstrated on page 207, stating, sometimes it was like he was reading a book where no one else could see. Sometimes it was like he was listening to people's thoughts, and sometimes it was just his feelings, bad feelings, and he didn't want to know any of it, but he couldn't stop it. This short statement really depicts Danny losing his innocence, and it really parallels to the biblical story of Adam and Eve and the fall of man and the loss of innocence. Wendy in particular is quick to notice the struggles of Danny, and we find her on page 51 voicing her worries. It's quoted, Wendy had insisted on a phone in spite of their unraveling finances. She argued that with a small child, especially a boy like Danny, who sometimes suffered from fainting spells, they couldn't afford to not have one. This quote speaking on Danny's fainting is an exemplar point of the harm The Shining causes Danny, while also showing both the financial and mental impacts on others in the family. The power of the supernatural not only harms Danny, but in the same way also harms Jack. We view this first on page 48. When it's recited, in his ears he could still hear that huge contraptual booming sound and smell his own urine as he voided himself in the extremity of his terror. The effect Danny's supernatural condition has on others is talked about heavily by Laura Joyce in her article Deadly Landscapes. She speaks on the overlook and its haunted feel, paired with Danny's strange abilities. Laura explains to us how both of these affect everyone as a collective in the overlook. In addition to this, it is also seen by Anne Williams in her article The Horror, where she communicates the prominent supernatural gifts of Danny and how they cause further harm than aid. Both of these examples of Danny's harm spreading through onto others link closely to the fall of man, and how the temptations of Adam and Eve affect the rest of humanity through the separation of God. Lastly, Leonard Mostaza communicates the general significance of supernatural elements in Gothic literature, which backs the argument of Stephen King's intentions and even the possibility of a direct link towards the story of the fall of man. To close off with a short summary, we see in The Shining the biblical lessons paralleled by the consequential results of Danny's supernatural capabilities, through the fall of man in both the knowledge of good and evil and the loss of innocence.
Overall, Stephen King's The Shining stands as a detailed exploration to the duality of human nature, holding several closely mirroring themes to the biblical story of the fall of man. Through Jack's gradual corruption, Wendy's actions of heroism and resilience, and the various supernatural themes of the Overlook Hotel setting that we explored in the presentation, King attempts to depict a grander message to the innate sin of all human beings, as the external forces we often deem as being evil stem from our uncontrolled inner selves. With my analysis focusing on the significance on Jack's corruption through his isolation, it becomes clear that the perceptions of Wendy and Danny fail to address the truth of his downfall stemming from his own inner flaws, with King's use of symbolism through the wasp nest demonstrating his gradual surrender to his previously concealed temptation and temper. Drawing connections to the fall of man, Torrance's inability to control his temptations holds a strong parallel to the wrongful actions of Adam and Eve, as both works reveal the detrimental consequences of allowing internal evil forces to overpower correct judgment.
Stephen King portrays domestic violence in The Shining as a cycle of fear and psychological trauma that destroys family bonds and individual sanity. He suggests that violence is inherited as a cycle of generational trauma, corrupting the abuser and everyone around him. The moral and psychological decay mirrors the biblical fall of man, where the original sin brought suffering and corruption. His portrayal of Wendy from passive victim to a figure of empowerment reflects Eve's shift from innocence to awareness, reflecting humanity's struggle for redemption after moral sin.
In my analysis, I focused on the supernatural themes in the novel. Stephen King is able to seamlessly embed supernatural elements into The Shining, which not only enhances the American Gothic themes, but also connects to the biblical ideology of the fall of man. Danny's ability connects to the biblical themes of the forbidden knowledge, and as a result, the loss of innocence, both of which Stephen King mirrors throughout his novel.
Michaela, what do you think is the main message our viewers should take away from this presentation?
That's a great question. Ultimately, if you're going to take anything away from this presentation, it's the intentional message of The Shining that Stephen King portrays. By using themes of isolation, domestic abuse, and psychological decay, King creates the undeniable resemblance to the story of the fall of man, conveying a message of the unforgiving consequences of giving into inner temptation.
I completely agree. The Shining isn't just some horror story. It serves as a warning to how the human mind can fall if we allow our inner evil to get ahead of us.
Thank you for listening to our presentation. And if you have any questions or possible feedback, feel free to contact us or leave it in the comments below.